In the last chapter of The Borrowers, the boy pried up the board in the kitchen that's right above their house. And they were very shocked and surprised, but he did it because he wanted to bring them some things. And so eventually they kind of were like, oh, this isn't too bad because Pa doesn't have to go out borrowing, right? And Homily likes having some kind of nice things. So when he put the board back, remember Homily said, put it back lightly so that he could pull it back up easily and give them more things. So they're concerned that they not only have been seen, but they're talking to the boy, but he doesn't seem to be wanting to cause them any harm. So they're kind of okay with it. We'll see what happens. Now, if you remember, right, all of this story is being told by Mrs. May. Remember, she is telling it to a girl named Kate at the beginning of the book. And this story about the clocks is one that Mrs. May's brother told her that happened to him. So he claims all this is true, and Mrs. May is telling it to Kate. If you remember that way back in the first couple chapters. All right, here we go. Chapter 16. Then began a curious phase in their lives. Borrowings beyond all dreams of borrowings. A golden age. Every night the floor was opened, and treasures would appear. A real carpet for the sitting room. A tiny coal scuttle. A stiff little sofa with damask cushions. A double bed with a round bolster. A single ditto with a striped mattress. Framed pictures instead of stamps. A kitchen stove, which didn't work but which looked lovely in the kitchen. There were oval tables and square tables and a little desk with one drawer. There were 2 maple wardrobes, one with a looking glass, that's like a mirror, and a bureau with a curved legs. Homily grew not only accustomed to the roof coming off, but even went so far as to suggest to Pod that he put the board on hinges. "It's just the hammering I don't care for," she explained. "It brings down the dirt." When the boy brought them a grand piano, Homily begged Pod to build a drawing room. "Next to the sitting room," she said, "and we could move the storerooms farther down. Then we could have those gilt chairs he talks about. Oh, and the palm in a pot." Pod, however, was a little tired of furniture removing. He was looking forward to the quiet evenings when he could doze at last beside the fire in his new red velvet chair. No sooner had he put a chest of drawers in one place when Homily, coming in and out of the door to get the effect, made him try it somewhere else. And every evening, at about his usual bedtime, the roof would fly up and more stuff would arrive. But Homily was tireless. Bright-eyed and pink-cheeked after a long day's pushing and pulling, she still would leave nothing until morning. "Oh, let's just try it," she would beg, lifting up one end of a large doll's sideboard so that Pod would have to lift the other. "It won't take a minute." But as Pod well knew, in actual fact, it would be several hours before, disheveled and aching, they finally dropped into bed. Even when Homily would sometimes hop out to have one last look. In the meantime, in payment for these riches, Arrietty would read to the boy every afternoon in the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He would lie on his back, and she would stand beside his shoulder and tell him when to turn the page. They were happy days to look back on afterward, with the blue sky beyond the cherry boughs, the grasses softly stirring, and the boy's great ear listening beside her. She grew to know that ear quite well, with its curves and shadows and sunlit pinks and golds. Sometimes, as she grew bolder, she would lean against his shoulder. He was very still while she read to him, and always grateful. What worlds they would explore together, strange worlds to Arrietty. She learned a lot, and some of the things she learned were hard to accept. She was made to realize once and for all that this earth on which they lived, turning about in space, did not revolve, as she had believed, for the sake of little people. Nor for big people either, she reminded the boy, when she saw his secret smile. So remember when they had that conversation where the boy kind of told her, I don't think there's any more borrowers, but there's millions of people. And so that kind of frightened her a little bit, but now she's realizing it's kind of true. In the cool of the evening, Pod would come for her, a rather weary Pod, disheveled and dusty, and take her back for tea. And at home there would be an excited Homily and fresh delights to discover. "Oh, shut your eyes," Homily would cry. "Now open them." And Arrietty, in a dream of joy, would see her home transformed. All kinds of surprises there were. Even one day, lace curtains at the grating looped up with pink string. Their only sadness was that there was no one there to see. No visitors, no casual droppers in, no admiring cries and envious glances. What would Homily have not given for an overmantel or a harpsichord? Even a rain barrel would have been better than no one at all. Remember, those are their last names of the other borrowers. You write to your Uncle Hendreary, Homily suggested, and tell him. A nice long letter, mind, and don't leave anything out. Arrietty began the letter on the back of one of the discarded pieces of blotting paper, but it became, as she wrote it, just a dull list, far too long, like a sale catalog, or the inventory of a house to let. She would have to keep jumping up to count spoons or to look up words in the dictionary, and after a while she laid it aside. There was so much else to do, so many new books to read, and so much now that she could talk of with the boy. He's been ill, she told her mother and father. He's been here for the quiet and the country air, and soon he'll go back to India. Did you know, she asked the amazed Homily, that the Arctic night lasts 6 months, and that the distance between the two poles is less than that between the two extremities of a diameter drawn through the equator? Yes, they were happy days, and all would have been well, as Pod said afterward, if they had stuck to borrowing from the doll's house. No one in the human household seemed to remember it was there, and consequently, nothing was missed. The drawing room, however, could not help but be a temptation. It was so seldom used nowadays. There were so many knick-knack tables which had been out of Pod's reach, and the boy, of course, could turn the key in the glass doors of the cabinet. Now remember, the borrowers call it borrowing, but the boy said it kind of sounds like stealing, and they're not touching anything there because it kind of would be stealing and people would notice that things would be gone. The silver violin, he brought them first, and then the silver harp. It stood no higher than Pod's shoulder, and Pod restrung it with horsehair from the sofa in the morning room. A musical conversation, that's what we could have, cried the exalted Homily as Arrietty struck a tiny tuneless note on a horsehair string. If only, she went on fervently, clasping her hands, your father would start in that drawing room. She curled her hair nearly every evening nowadays, and since the house was more or less straight, she would occasionally change for dinner into a satin dress. It hung like a sack, but Homily called it Grecian. We could use your painted ceiling, she exclaimed to Arrietty, and there are quite enough of those toy builder's bricks to make a parquet floor. Parquet, she would say, parquet, just like a harpsichord. Even Aunt Sophie, right away upstairs in the littered grandeur of her bedroom, seemed distantly affected by a spirit of endeavor which seemed to flow in gleeful whirls and eddies about the staid old house. Several times lately, Pod, when he went to her room, had found her out of bed. He went there nowadays not to borrow, but to rest. The room, one might almost say, had become his club, a place to which he could go to get away from things. Pod was a little irked by his riches. He had never visualized, not in his wildest dreams, borrowing such as this. Homily, he felt, should call a halt. Surely now their home was grand enough. These jeweled snuff boxes and diamond-encrusted miniatures, these filigree vanity cases and Dresden figurines, all as he knew from the drawing-room cabinet, were not really necessary. What was the good of a shepherdess nearly as tall as Arrietty, or an outsized candle snuffer? Sitting just inside the fender where he could warm his hands at the fire, he watched Aunt Sophie hobble slowly round the room on her 2 sticks. "She'll be downstairs soon, I shouldn't wonder," he thought glumly, hardly listening to her oft-told tale about a royal luncheon aboard a Russian yacht. "And she'll miss these things." It was not Aunt Sophie, however, who missed them first. It was Mrs. Driver. Mrs. Driver had never forgotten the trouble over Rosa Pickhatchet. It had not been, at the time, easy to pinpoint the guilt. Even Crampfurl had felt under suspicion. "From now on," Mrs. Driver had said, "I'll manage on me own. No more strange maids in this house. Not if I'm to stay on myself." A drop of Madeira here, a pair of old stockings there, a handkerchief or so, an odd vest, or an occasional pair of gloves. Well, these Mrs. Driver felt were different. These were within her rights. But trinkets out of the drawing-room cabinet, that, she told herself grimly, staring at the depleted shelves, was a different story altogether. Remember, Rosa Pickhatchet was the maid who was dusting when she dusted Uncle Hendreary and he sneezed, and she said she saw a little man, and then they noticed things were missing, and then she got fired because they thought she made up a story about seeing a little man to hide her stealing. And now they're noticing more things are missing. She felt tricked, standing there on that fateful day in the spring sunshine, feather duster in hand. Her little black eyes had become slits of anger and cunning. It was, she calculated, as though someone, suspecting her dishonesty, were trying to catch her out. But who could it be? Crampfurl? That boy? The man who came to wind the clocks? These things had disappeared gradually, one by one. It was someone of that, she felt sure, who knew the house, and someone who wished her ill. Could it, she wondered suddenly, be the old lady herself? The old girl had been out of bed lately and walking about her room. Might she not have come downstairs in the night, poking about with her stick, snooping and spying? Mrs. Driver remembered suddenly the empty Madeira bottle and the 2 glasses, which so often were left on the kitchen table. Ah, thought Mrs. Driver, was not this just the sort of thing that she might do? The sort of thing that she would cackle over back upstairs again among her pillows, watching and waiting for Mrs. Driver to report the loss? "Everything all right downstairs, Driver?" That's what she'd always say, and she would look at Mrs. Driver sideways out of those wicked old eyes of hers. "I wouldn't put it past her," Mrs. Driver exclaimed aloud, gripping her feather duster as though it were a club. "And a nice merry andrew she'd look if I caught her at it, creeping about the downstairs rooms in the middle of the night." "All right, my lady," muttered Mrs. Driver grimly. "Pry and potter all you want. 2 could play at that game." So she thinks maybe Great Aunt Sophie is the one who's coming downstairs and taking things to basically make Mrs. Driver look guilty. So, because she has no idea. So now we're going to have to see what happens.